From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, in for David Weston. We begin, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine, where a large convoy of Russian troops is moving slowly towards Kyiv as fighting intensifies. And for more, we're joined now by Bloomberg Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern, who is at the White House. Anne-Marie, I'd like to start with the story that you helped to break here, a scoop on the terminal. The IEA is now confirming what you already told us, a massive coordinated release of oil from strategic reserves. How will it work?
Yes, the fourth time ever in the IEA's history that they're doing this once again, a drawdown of their reserves of these members. What's going to happen, Joe, is that 30 million will come from the United States. The remainder 30 million will come from the remainder of those part of the IEA, like Japan and a number of others. And this is, of course, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They're quite concerned about the risk to the market. Russia is the third biggest producer of fossil fuels. It is the second biggest exporter of oil. And this is why you're seeing this impact in the prices this morning. You see WTI going through to $105 a barrel. This will trickle down to everyday consumers. And the press secretary just released a statement on this, talking about once again the U.S. is acting alongside their partners to mitigate some of these, but also said, as the president has been saying, everything is on the table to make sure they can protect American businesses and consumers. And she said that it also means those at the pump.
Anne-Marie, what kind of an impact will it have on prices? They seem to be going in the opposite direction that the White House wanted to here. You remember the last strategic reserve that you reported on from the U.S. It didn't go a long way to lowering prices for long.
Yeah, just a few cents, really. This could have some impact, but we cannot forget that Russia is just a massive player in the commodity world. And this is why you're seeing prices just continue to trickle higher. You see a number of companies, massive oil and gas companies, actually saying they are no longer going to be they're letting go of their stakes. We have BP, Equinor, Shell. They no longer, and they're going to be divesting the stakes they have in Russia. Now, while the administration is talking about carve-outs for the energy sector, whether or not banks can do these trades regarding SWIFT or energy companies have to move banks. I reported on Exxon having to move banks before the announcement came out because one of the banks they used to pay their employees was going to be sanctioned. You're going to probably start to have, Joe, just companies want to have their own self-sanctioning because the situation may become too toxic to deal with Putin's Russia. And other people I'm talking to in the industry said, try to find me a ship that's willing to go pick up Russian crude right now. It's incredibly difficult.
And that's why we're looking at $106 a barrel for WTI. Anne-Marie, it looks like we're entering a new phase of this war, or at least we're about to. As I mentioned, this massive convoy that's on its way to Kyiv. We saw shelling in Kharkiv earlier. Is the White House prepared to watch this happen?
Well, they have been preparing for this in the sense that they've been telling us the intelligence, and this was part of President Putin's plan. And many questioned it, if Putin would go this far into Ukraine. The issue now, Joe, of course, is that this is going to become a massive humanitarian crisis. What we heard from European officials over the weekend is this can mean 7 million Ukrainians displaced. This is going to have a massive impact on Europe. They've already dealt with refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan. Now, Poland and the Baltics are going to be really ground zero for these individuals leaving Ukraine. So the administration is calling on Congress, and Schumer talked about this yesterday, about billions of dollars to help with this humanitarian level of this crisis. And a lot of that money would go to not just Ukraine, but Poland and the Baltic states, which are really going to be dealing with the influx of these refugees.
Many thanks to Bloomberg Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern. I suspect that we'll be hearing about that from President Biden tonight in the State of the Union address. Anne-Marie will join me along with the rest of our Washington team here, 8:30 Washington time, 8:30 tonight for the State of the Union and special coverage here on Bloomberg. For more on the invasion of Ukraine and the impact on the geopolitical landscape now, we're joined by William Cohen, U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton, former senator from Maine, CEO of the Cohen Group. Mr. Secretary, welcome. It's great to have you with us at this time. I wonder what it is we're about to witness in Ukraine. The images of this convoy now heading to Kyiv, as I mentioned, rocket attacks on Kharkiv. Is this going to come down to street fighting in the next couple of days?
I believe it will. I think that President Putin has really made the decision to take over not only the city, but take over the country. So neutrality, if it was an option, is no longer an option. I think that what President Putin has decided that he wants to annex or incorporate Ukraine into Mother Russia. And I think we're going to see an assault that will be launched that will be very deadly. It'll kill a lot of innocent people. And I think that there are only two ways ultimately this can be resolved. Either President Putin can take counsel from those without his circle, other countries like Russia, like China, like India, like Israel, other countries who have relationships with him, I think could give him counsel that this is something that has to be stopped. And there's a way out of this. The other thing is a revolution from within. Because this is going to hurt the Russian people in dramatic ways, if not immediately, then over the next weeks and months and possibly years. Yeah. So that will stir great discontent from within, and I think that's something that President Putin has not counted on, and something he should be aware of.
There's so much history in Kyiv, in the city of Kyiv, whether it's the cathedrals or the government buildings. Mr. Secretary, does Vladimir Putin want to preserve Kyiv and occupy that city? Or does he want to flatten it?
I think he would like to take it over without flattening it. But as he's done in Chechnya, he will do whatever it takes to subordinate or make the country submit to his will. So I'm expecting a terrible assault upon the people of Kyiv in order to make that government crumble, to grab President Zelensky, try him or for war crimes as such, or kill him. So I think he's going to put his own puppet government in. And then the question becomes, can Putin succeed in holding on to that country if there is some sort of a government in exile, an insurgency that is fueled and funded by the Western world?
I know.
But in the short term, it's going to be fairly chaotic and bloody, and a lot of people are going to die.
President Biden has pledged no American troops in Ukraine. We know the administration does not favor setting up a no-fly zone. This is about to get ugly, obviously. Is the greatest military power in the world about to sit back and watch this happen?
I think the greatest military power in the world does not want to come face to face with the Russians, both of us, have large amounts of nuclear weapons. To the extent that we were ever engaged in a war on a conventional basis, that can escalate very quickly up the nuclear chain. And then you will have what the poet T.S. Eliot said, "I'll show you fear in a handful of dust." It will be the desolation not only of Russia and parts of the West, many parts of the West, but this is something that all of our friends have to understand. If you have a conflict between the United States and Russia, and should it perchance go into the nuclear realm, no one on this planet is safe. Radioactive waste doesn't stay in Russia, doesn't stay in the United States. It spreads around the world. And that's why I think we have to do everything in our power to persuade President Putin there is a way off on this. There is an accommodation that can be made to your security interests, but you can't do it at the point of a gun barrel. And that's what the West has to stand up and resist, because if he incorporates Ukraine, who's next? Is it going to be Georgia? Is it going to be some other countries, Moldova? Is it going to be those countries on the periphery? Will it be the Balkan states? All of those will be at risk. And so we have to draw the line in saying we're going to wage an economic war, and we're also going to wage an information war. The Russian people don't understand what you're doing right now. We need to make them aware of that.
Speaking of countries on the periphery, the other side of this story, Mr. Secretary, is the looming and already begun now refugee crisis that many anticipated in countries like Poland, Slovakia, that have seen, we understand, in excess of 500,000 people cross the border. Is the U.S. doing enough to help absorb them?
We will do whatever is necessary. We can't afford to allow these people, thousands of people, go without food or shelter or some sense of security. So I think the United States, with our Western allies, and this is something I don't think Putin has counted upon, the unanimity of the Western alliance has been strong, EU, NATO, and he's up against a world that's going to hold him certainly in contempt, and he will carry the mark of Cain on his brow for years to come. And so rather than restoring the glory of Russia's past, what he is doing is making Russia a pariah throughout the world, and anything that bears the stamp of Russia will certainly not be greeted with enthusiasm. So trying to return to glory, this is not a way to achieve that. What he's going to do is return Russia to a point where other countries will look upon him as a threat and one that they won't want to do business with.
The president will walk into the House chamber tonight to deliver his State of the Union address, Mr. Secretary, against the backdrop of a war in Europe, something no one really could have predicted when he took office just over a year ago. What does he need to tell the American people and, frankly, the world who will be watching this speech tonight?
Well, he has to, I think, concede that we have brought some of this upon ourselves, that we have shown weakness in the past when dealing with Putin. We have invited Putin to invade our own country, at least through attacking us through bots and other misinformation, trying to alter our election. So we have brought some of this upon ourselves by non-reaction. So I think he has to say, we're in a different era now. Russia has made it clear it wants to solidify itself and dominate the European theater, return to the Russian Empire if it can. And we're in a conflict that we're going to try and keep as peaceful as possible, but it's going to be economic, it's going to be informational, and we have to rally the Western world. All people who love freedom have to understand their freedom is at stake if this gets out of hand.
Must he promise the American people that U.S. troops will not be involved in a war in Europe?
I think he will make that pledge, but understanding that if Putin, for any reason, fires or touches base with any of our NATO allies, then Article 5 becomes invoked and we will find ourselves in a war.
How concerned are you about that happening, William Cohen?
I'm concerned. I'm concerned now that we're at a very dangerous point in our relationship with Putin, and he doesn't seem to be doing anything other than intensifying the killing machine that he has control of right now. So I think it's hard to predict how he'll react. I think the economic pressures are going to be enormous on him, but I think he's betting that we will falter, the West will falter before Russia does, that he can absorb this hardship longer than we can. And that's something I think he's counting on, and that's a message I think that President Biden has to address. Will the West hold? Will we hold the line, to use a military phrase that General Mattis used to use, hold the line? Can we do that? So far we can. Can we hold it long enough in the future that Russia will back away from its plans to expand the Russian continent now to include all of Europe?
A grim assessment from our former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen. Thank you for being with us today. Coming up, we'll have more on the war in Ukraine and the response from the U.S., a conversation with Congresswoman and Air Force veteran Chrissy Houlahan. Coming up next, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Now for top stories from around the world, here's First Word with Mark Crumpton. Mark.
Joe, thank you. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is accusing Russian forces of committing acts of terror as the Kremlin intensified its offensive. Russian troops continue to shell military and civilian facilities. That's according to Ukraine's general staff. Satellite images showed a Russian military convoy on its way to Kyiv. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces hit the site of a TV tower in the capital city, which knocked out broadcasting there. As the fighting goes on, the Kremlin's international isolation is growing. The European Union is discussing the exclusion of 7 Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system. The United Kingdom is indicating it may follow. Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke today during a visit to Poland.
We're willing, if necessary, and I think it will be necessary, to go further. There is plainly more to be done on SWIFT. We can tighten up yet further on SWIFT. Even though it's had a dramatic effect already, I think we do need to go further. There's more to be done on Sparebank, more to be done on the freezing of Russian assets.
The Moscow stock market remained closed for a second day after Russia's economy was hammered by waves of sanctions. And many foreign companies are abandoning Russia. That's reversing 3 decades of business investment there since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Shell says it's ending partnerships with state-controlled Gazprom because of Russia's, quote, senseless act of military aggression, unquote. Daimler Truck is also ending business activities in Russia. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. President Biden is set to deliver his first State of the Union address tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. You'll be able to watch it and listen to it here on Bloomberg TV and radio, in addition to delving into issues such as the ongoing pandemic and, of course, the U.S. economy. Biden's expected to focus, of course, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, war in Europe. And for more, we bring in Representative Chrissy Houlahan, Democrat from Pennsylvania, an Air Force veteran. Congresswoman, it's great to have you. What do you want to hear specifically about the war in Ukraine from President Biden in the chamber tonight?
Of course, and thanks for having me. I hope to hear a variety of things from President Biden's conversation with the American people tonight. One is I do, of course, anticipate that he'll speak, I would anticipate at length on the Ukraine situation, and most likely try to continue to bring the American people in and along to understand why this matters and why this is important to all of us, and that we too as Americans might be asked to sacrifice as a result of the incursion of Putin into Ukraine. I also, frankly, hope that the president spends a lot of his time as well on a couple of other issues. One is addressing the good news, the optimism, the things that have happened that are good, which is we are coming out of Omicron, which is terrific. We have a record low unemployment rate right now, under 4% in my community, which is something to celebrate. Yeah. We also have to celebrate a lot in terms of the infrastructure deal. But the third thing I'm hoping that he says during the State of the Union is that he brings it down to the people and recognizes that all of this still is in an atmosphere where we have inflation that's pressuring people and their families.
That's what I want to ask you about, Congresswoman.
Well.
As I saw a statement that your office put out as we discussed this in a noisy rotunda in the Cannon office building. You wrote, I listened to mushroom farmers, daycare providers, small business owners, and others who are worn out and feel like no one is hearing them. How does President Biden get in their living rooms and speak directly to them?
Sure, and that's a really good microcosm of a story. 60% of the country's mushrooms come from my community, and our mushroom prices are going up. We don't have the labor to pick them, and we don't have the child care to be able to have laborers to pick them. And so we have to figure out how to work this so that we can decrease the price of mushrooms. And also, interestingly, it relates to Estonia, where some of the peat is coming from. So even what's going on in Ukraine is affecting the mushroom farmers. So these are the things that are everyday stories that are coming from communities like mine. And so I'm hoping that the president will be able to recognize that there are things that we can do to immediately help there with that issue. For instance, childcare, something that existed in the Build Back Better package. Hopefully we'll elevate that and push that through. Or the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which helps to bring more people in under visas so that we can be able to employ more people and get those mushrooms on people's tables. So there's just a lot of moving parts here, and that's what I'm hoping the president will recognize and understand.
Congresswoman, I know you were in Ukraine earlier this year. You met with President Zelensky. You have a good sense of the mood on the ground and what is motivating Ukrainians to literally pick up arms and fight Russians invading their country. I just wonder, as now President Zelensky is looked at as a bit of a hero here in the U.S., what did Vladimir Putin fail to factor into his rationale?
I think he has failed, which is surprising, to factor in the will of the people of that area of the world. The people of that area of the world, and I count myself among them because my father was born in Lviv, have been trounced upon over and over again, generation after generation, by autocrats and dictators. And they are used to fighting for their lives and for their freedoms. And so I think he underestimated the full force of what the Ukrainian peoples and their response would be.
Many thanks to Representative Chrissy Houlahan, Democrat from Pennsylvania, helping us look ahead to tonight's State of the Union address. Coming up, we'll take a look at some of the ways Ukraine is financing its resistance to the invasion from Russia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. The U.S. is releasing oil from its strategic petroleum reserve to offset pressure in the oil market. For more on the reaction in the market, somewhat counterintuitive, let's go to Bloomberg Markets correspondent Chrissy Gupta. Interesting to see we've got $106 a barrel, even as they try to take corrective measures to loosen up the market. What's going on?
Yeah, 60 million barrels. And this isn't just the United States. This is oil-consuming nations around the world. You're talking about Japan, South Korea, China, India. They are all part of those oil-consuming nation groups. So 60 million barrels, half of that coming from the United States. But the concern here is that the knee-jerk reaction was, of course, that you have more supply on the market. That should mean oil drops, right? And it did for a hot second. And then you had traders essentially realize that 60 million is equivalent to about 6 days of Russia output. That's not that much in the grand scheme of things. So then you saw this kind of idea that if the White House is seriously taking this to the point where they have to release from the SPR for the second time, we should add, by the way, during the Biden administration, then things are really bad. So you did see this kind of rush to the oil markets after that.
Yeah, the price correction, if we can call it that, the downturn didn't last long after the first release. What does this mean for oil companies, oil stocks today?
Yeah, well, it's kind of seen as a short-term, essentially a Band-Aid on a situation. It's meant for wartime, essentially. But the problem here is those reserves, they're really dwindling, even for the United States and for around the world, because once again, this is the second time that has happened. What's really important about this is that the kind of rush to oil right now, the $106 a barrel that you're seeing on Brent, 105 on WTI, that's still pushing oil company stocks higher because it means they're making more at the end of the day.
Unreal. One of the more fascinating stories of the day has been the way Ukraine is financing this operation. Of course, a lot of nations, including the U.S., are helping to fund the war, maybe not involved on the ground. But now it's time for Ukrainian war bonds. Who's buying them?
Yeah, well, $277 million were already raised by Ukraine through these war bonds. And if you won't remember this because I don't think you were alive, Joe, but the last time you saw war bonds come into kind of fruition was in World War II. And you raised, the United States raised $186 billion. So this is a really big deal. They were able to do $277 million of fundraising. And that's, of course, in addition to the donations that are pouring in from the IMF, from the World Bank, help from other countries as well. And, of course, the crypto financing, that's a piece of it. But you asked who's buying these bonds. What's interesting is compare this to Russia, where they're saying Russia is uninvestable at the moment. Ukraine is still seen as having a lot of support and the idea that perhaps they're going to align themselves closer to Europe. So you are still seeing that exposure that way.
So it's not just an investment of principle. People actually expect to get their money back.
Absolutely. This is 100%. This is not going to last forever. Ukraine is going to be closer to the EU and therefore a better bet. Fascinating,
as always, in a conversation with Chrissy Gupta. Thank you, Chrissy. Coming up, we're counting down to the State of the Union address tonight. 9 o'clock Eastern. More on that still ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Keeping you up to date now with news from around the world, we turn to First Word with Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Joe, thank you. The European Union is discussing more sanctions against Russia today. It now seeks to block 7 Russian banks from SWIFT, the system that facilitates international payments between institutions. That's according to a draft list of the proposal. One of the banks is VTB, one of Russia's largest. The UK has also imposed sanctions on VTB. NATO says it has not changed the status of its nuclear forces in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to put his nation's nuclear command on high alert. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told NBC News the alliance is not increasing its nuclear readiness. NATO says the purpose of its nuclear forces is to deter aggression. And Bloomberg has learned that the U.S. and other major economies have agreed on a coordinated release of its oil stockpiles. The International Energy Agency will deploy 60 million barrels from reserves around the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has pushed crude above $100 a barrel. In China, there's a sign that the government's pro-growth policies have started to kick in. The economy gained momentum this month. The official Purchasing Managers Index rose above the 50 level, the line that separates expansion from contraction. New orders placed at Chinese manufacturers picked up in February. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. At 9 p.m. tonight, Eastern Time, President Biden delivers his first formal State of the Union address, a speech that's likely very different than the one he originally planned.
America is on the move again.
On the eve of his 100th day in office, President Biden made lofty declarations to a joint session of Congress and laid out his vision for his administration.
America is ready for a takeoff, in my view. We're working again, dreaming again, discovering again, and leading the world again.
The president, however, has faced many hurdles, from a pandemic that has lingered long past when he had hoped to a steady and persistent rise in inflation. And while he came into office hoping for bipartisanship, many of the priorities Biden laid out in his first address have not landed.
Let's raise the minimum wage to $15. That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America. The American Families Plan will finally provide up to 12 weeks of paid leave and medical leave.
The American Families Plan, which was later rebranded as Build Back Better, is dead, leaving those promises unfulfilled. The president also laid out a series of domestic goals that he has not been able to reach, including stricter gun laws, police reform, voting rights reform, and immigration reform.
The country supports this reform, and Congress should act. Bravo.
Biden did, however, deliver on some of the promises he made during last year's address, including passing a bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes massive investments in fixing roads and bridges and in electric vehicles and broadband. Biden also pledged to remove all U.S. troops from Afghanistan during his first year in office, and while he followed through, the withdrawal was marred by the death of 13 American service members. That disaster in Afghanistan also saw a rapid return to power of the Taliban and is widely considered a foreign policy fiasco. When it comes to Russia, Ukraine was not even mentioned last year. Instead, Biden focused on election meddling.
So I responded directly and proportionally to Russia's interference in our elections and the cyber attacks on our government and our business.
Biden will return to the House chamber more than a year into what has been a very challenging first term.
We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works, and we can deliver for our people.
Still trying to prove that government, bitterly divided, can in fact deliver for the American people. For more, we bring in Bloomberg opinion columnist Jonathan Bernstein. Jonathan, it's great to have you here as we consider the backdrop of this speech, not just a war in Europe, but also some very challenging polling numbers. We saw the ABC poll with 37% approval, a career low over the weekend. One that really jumped out to me was Suffolk University for USA Today. More than half Americans, half the respondents, 51%, believe the U.S. is in a recession or a depression, despite 6 million new jobs, 5.7% GDP last year. Jonathan, what could President Biden possibly say that hasn't already been displayed?
Well, you can't expect much from a single speech. State of the Union speech is not going to change everybody's perception of the economy. There's no question. You're absolutely right. Despite great economic growth numbers and pretty good job numbers, people think that the economy stinks, and a lot of that is inflation. My speculation is that a lot of it is simply the pandemic. People have been, especially through the Omicron, the worst of the Omicron wave, have been very depressed about everything, and they are turning on the economy and subsequently turning on Joe Biden. That said, you highlighted a couple polling numbers.
Yeah.
Not quite so bad for him. He's in the low 40s, probably around 41%, not really the 30s. So, that's bad. It's almost as bad as Donald Trump was at this point 4 years ago. That's the second worst president popularity any president has had at this stage of his presidency.
Donald Trump didn't sign into law the infrastructure bill, though, or some of the other things that Joe Biden will talk about tonight. How much time, Jonathan, does Joe Biden need to spend on what he has accomplished versus his view going forward?
Well, I think he's going to spend some time sort of pointing out, he has a strange legislative record in the first year. The infrastructure bill, as you point out, and the economic rescue bill, pandemic rescue bill at the beginning of the year were major pieces of legislation, more so than, Trump, for example, or Bill Clinton, for example, passed during his first year or first 4 years, really. That's true. At the same time, there are these major failures with voting rights and with Build Back Better. That don't, voting rights seems completely dead. Build Back Better, if it is revived, is not going to be what he hoped it would be. So, he's going to try to frame that, but he also has to talk about Ukraine, because that's obviously the biggest thing going on right now.
Well, let's just stick with domestic for a moment here. I'll ask you about what he needs to say about Ukraine, but you pointed out two big ones: Build Back Better, voting rights legislation. I don't suspect we'll hear the brand Build Back Better tonight, even though he'll likely speak to the components underneath. But something's going to happen after the speech, Jonathan. Not only a Republican response, but there's going to be a Democratic response to the Democratic president. Rashida Tlaib, a member of the so-called squad, will be speaking later, obviously not happy about the way these two worked out. Voting rights legislation, Build Back Better, child tax credit, and so forth. So this president is going to have to hear criticism from his own party after he speaks tonight. How damaging is that?
Oh, I don't think that's, what's happening is there's actually not one, but three Democratic responses to the Democratic president. And that has much less to do with Joe Biden than it does with the demise of local media. In the old days, members of Congress would go straight to their local media, their local news broadcasts, and that would get replayed several times.
Yeah.
Nowadays, very few people watch that. So it makes more sense to do these grand responses because people can watch that over the internet and without the intermediation of local news.
What does the president need to say about the war in Ukraine then, Jonathan Bernstein? He's going to have the nation's attention. The world will also be watching. Does he have to go out of his way to promise that the U.S. will not get involved in a war in Europe?
I think he does. It's been this for most people who don't pay a lot of attention to the news, it's sort of come out of nowhere to be a major headline. And he needs to inform the American people, no, this is not going to be a shooting war with American casualties. America is not going to get involved in this war with troops. At the same time, he's got multiple audiences. And one of the difficulties in presidential speeches is always multiple audiences. The truth is that Joe Biden, in terms of popularity, doesn't really want to talk about foreign policy at all. It's not a natural issue for Democrats, and it's definitely not something that most Americans care about day to day, the way they care about inflation. But he has to do it because it's an international audience, and he's going to be sending messages to Putin. He's going to be sending messages to the allies that, yes, the United States is staying very much involved in the response.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki says President Biden will use the word inflation tonight. Jonathan, how does he get to that issue without delivering the malaise speech that so many people have suggested going back to the days of Jimmy Carter?
He has to, what he'll probably do is talk about what he's doing to alleviate it. Now, whether people, it doesn't matter what he says. It matters what the outcomes will be. If inflation stays 7% through the election, Democrats are going to get clobbered. If inflation moderates, whether it's because of the things Biden does or not, people will feel better about it. So he's going to talk about supply chains and the things that he's doing with ports. He's going to talk about, whatever things he's trying to do. The truth is that he thinks, the White House economists seem to think, that inflation is on its way to moderating by itself, that it's a post-pandemic thing.
Right.
And there's not much he can say to convince people that it has to actually happen.
Well, is this speech going to be a post-pandemic thing? They've dropped the mask mandate in the House. I'm wondering if Joe Biden walks in with a mask and if he tells the nation that we've turned the corner.
It's a real good question. He has been, people seem to think he's still doing a pretty good job on the pandemic compared to the other things. So it sort of is a natural thing for him to talk about. But the truth is that the back-to-back Delta plus Omicron really clobbered his approval ratings. Yeah. Public opinion is driven by it. Now that Omicron's gone, he has to make a decision. Do you celebrate that, or do you prepare people for the next wave, which he doesn't know whether it'll come and what it'll be like? So that's not an easy communication strategy question.
Bloomberg opinion columnist Jonathan Bernstein. We thank you, Jonathan, for the insights. Coming up, an exclusive conversation with Cigna CEO David Cordani. That's straight ahead. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, in for David Weston. Thanks for joining us. Cigna has announced it will increase its share repurchase authorization. And the health giant also plans to spend more than $7 billion on buybacks in 2022. For more, we welcome the CEO of Cigna, David Cordani. Welcome, David, to Balance of Power. As you take a look at the gyrations in the stock market here, what does this buyback mean for your shares?
So for us, it's a good reinforcement of the confidence we have in our overall portfolio of businesses and our growth outlook, where for 2022, we'll have another year of good, strong growth and expansion of the customers we're able to serve around the world. In support of that, we'll have about $12 billion of deployable capital. And while we'll invest over $1 billion in innovation, another $500 million into our venture program, it presented a great opportunity to reinforce the strength of our business by committing to purchasing a significant amount of our stock back. The intermediate term gyrations don't affect the overall repurchase program and the investment back into our company.
We're preparing, David, for an important speech tonight from President Biden, the State of the Union. We've spent the better part of this hour talking to the issues that he'll be addressing this evening. And I want to ask you about a big one that impacts you. The Senate's considering elements of the drug pricing legislation that was in what we used to call the Build Back Better bill. I realize that's not what we call it anymore, and it may emerge in a different form. To that end, though, that's what the president is expected to speak to tonight. As a large drug benefit manager, how does Cigna feel about that proposal, specifically Medicare negotiating prices for some of the higher cost therapies that are out there?
So overall, improving affordability for the benefit of Americans is a shared priority. And a public-private partnership to accelerate further improvements of affordability, we're fully aligned with. Two, the ability to further improve overall affordability of pharmaceuticals, for example, has to be looked at in conjunction with overall mental well-being and physical well-being. And our broad array of services are really well positioned to work with the federal government, state governments, health plans, and large employers relative to that. Yeah. And we look forward to continuing to partner with the government to further improve affordability, but it's really through coordination of programs as opposed to any one singular price adjustment.
How about coordinating with the administration? Have you heard from this White House as a major insurer about this effort that he'll likely discuss tonight?
So I won't speak to any individual term, but we tend to collaborate aggressively because we view that healthcare policy is highly personal and therefore not partisan in any way, shape, or form. So we collaborate with the White House. We also collaborate with Congress. We collaborate with Health and Human Services. And maybe as a concrete example, we were first to step forward by providing an insulin-based program that capped the cost of insulin to members at $25 per month. We shared the design of that program with HHS, and that actually became an underpinning for some evolved programs for seniors through Medicare. So yes, we do collaborate with this White House as well as with other influential leadership within D.C. proper.
We're seeing mandates for vaccinations, for masks come down in this sort of post-Omicron phase that we're in, David. Are patients returning to care now that we're seeing Omicron fade?
So what we've seen broadly, now we're at the 2-year mark, so it's been a long journey. Early on in the pandemic, we absolutely saw a decrease in utilization of medical services outside of COVID. But as you went through the first year, in the commercial space, so those insured through employers, we largely saw consumption of services in line with historical averages. In Medicare, we saw most of the services in line with historical, and for Medicaid, we saw it below. So to answer your question, we're in an environment right now that consumption of services are more in line with historical levels, and then there's some COVID utilization above and beyond that, depending on the geography or population you're serving.
It's one of the best indicators we have getting back to normal. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, as a company, we've been very active in terms of ensuring that even through the pandemic, preventative care and what's called evidence-based care, so support of pharmaceuticals for those on chronic disease, has stayed quite constant over the 2 years, and we're proud of that.
David, I want to ask you about what's happening in Ukraine. I know you have a number of customers and clients in that region. Give us the view of a corporation that's trying to navigate this conflict in the middle of a crisis here, in the middle of a war. I understand you've set up a team that's focused on checking in and caring for those clients. What kind of needs do they have? Are you hearing from many of them?
Yeah, we're a global health service company, so we literally have customers everywhere in the world. Specific to what's taking place in Ukraine, before we get to our customer programs, all of us within our company, as well as across the United States, our hearts go out to the citizens of Ukraine who are going through a rather horrific environment. Specific to what we're doing in support, our foundation has been activated, our coworker giving program and matching program has been active. The customers we serve in Ukraine and in the region are being supported through our existing programs and then elevated access programs, hotlines, outbound communications, SMSs, et cetera, that we're able to bring the breadth of our global resources forward. So we'll continue to press ourselves to provide whatever support we can to our customers as well as to the citizens in that region.
Based on what we're seeing in Ukraine, David, this could become a much more difficult scenario in the next couple of days as Russia bears down. Are you seeking redundancies or other ways to communicate with clients, or even if you have employees in that region, if, for instance, power goes out, cell phone signals go down?
Simple answer is yes. Again, being a global health service company, we support some of the largest IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as well as large corporations. So while not this is something that you're used to, you have infrastructure in place to be able to deliver with all types of disruption and putting the needs of those customers front and center and the local communities. We will press ourselves in every way, shape, or form. And to your point, leverage redundancies and leverage some creative innovation of our local resources to make sure we're supporting our customers.
A peek inside the corporate view on a war in Europe with David Cordani. We thank you, David. Cigna chairman and CEO. Still ahead, Citadel founder CEO Ken Griffin talks markets and the war in Ukraine for the new season of Bloomberg Wealth. Highlights from that conversation and the news coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in for David Weston. Geopolitical tensions are, of course, dominating the world stage now as investors grapple with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Citadel founder and CEO Ken Griffin sat down exclusively with Carlyle's David Rubenstein for Bloomberg Wealth to discuss the fallout in the markets. Take a listen.
So people often do not appreciate how forward-looking financial markets are. When a company announces a great quarter and you see the stock price fall, people go, well, I mean, how did that happen? It's because investors had anticipated an even better quarter. Markets are forward-looking by nature. This year, we've seen the market sell off quite a bit up to the date of the invasion of the Ukraine. Anxiety about higher interest rates, worries about the war. As the war broke out, though, the narrative changed. We started to talk about lower interest rates for longer. We started to talk about how different governments were going to react to this vis-a-vis Russia and the scope of the sanctions that would be unfolded. And the consensus over the course of the trading day was that the worst news was behind us, and the prospect of easier monetary policy, less draconian sanctions than feared, created a relief rally.
And do you expect that this will gyrate, these gyrations will continue for some time as long as Russia is in Ukraine, or you think the markets have basically made their assessment by now?
No, I think we're at a very, very, very volatile inflection point. It will come down to whether or not the Russians will be satisfied by simply extending their effective borders in the Ukraine. Will they take Kiev? Will they position themselves to reach beyond the borders of the Ukraine? The last is terrifying to markets, right? They will be adjacent then to much of core Europe if they move their military onto the western border of the Ukraine. And that has the markets concerned. So much will unfold over the days to come or weeks to come as Russia's ambitions become clearer.
That was Ken Griffin, Citadel founder and CEO, speaking with David Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, talk to House Appropriations Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro about President Biden's funding request to assist Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.